What if the greatest misunderstanding in religious history isn't who God is, but what creation even means? For centuries, creation has been imagined as a moment of intention, a divine decision followed by command. But that assumption quietly merges two very different ideas into one figure. One does not act, the other must. And once you separate origin of being from organization of reality, an entirely different structure appears. So let me know where you're watching from, and let's dive in, shall we? Picture a throne room in ancient Babylon, around 600 BCE. The king sits elevated, surrounded by advisors and scribes. When he speaks, his word becomes reality. He commands a temple built, and laborers move. He declares war, and armies march. His authority transforms intention into action. This is how most people learn to imagine creation: God as cosmic sovereign, reality as royal decree, existence as obedience to divine will. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Command, manifestation, authority. But here's what's hidden in that image. It assumes the ultimate source of reality acts the way a ruler acts, through decision, intention, and power. It assumes creation is a project undertaken for reasons, carried out through will. And once you accept that assumption, everything else follows. God becomes a monarch. The cosmos becomes a kingdom. Beings become subjects. And the fundamental relationship between creator and creation becomes one of command and obedience. This isn't just theology. It's political power dressed in religious language. Ancient peoples understood kings. They watched rulers transform disorder into order, impose law on unruly populations, maintain structure through hierarchical authority. So when they tried to explain how the world came to be, they reached for the only large-scale creative power they knew: royal decree. But this creates a puzzle that troubled thinkers for centuries. If God is perfect, infinite, complete, lacking nothing, why would he create anything at all? Perfect beings don't have unmet needs. They don't require projects. They don't experience loneliness or boredom that would motivate action. Traditional answers appeared. God created out of love, out of a desire to share his goodness, out of the overflow of his perfection. But notice what those answers require. They give God motives, desires, emotional states that lead to decisions. And once you do that, you're no longer describing an absolute, infinite principle. You're describing a person, someone who feels, wants, chooses, and acts based on internal states. This works if you're building a religion around relationship with a personal deity, but it creates philosophical tangles that have occupied brilliant minds ever since. In the 3rd century, the philosopher Plotinus wrestled with exactly this problem. If the one, the ultimate principle, is absolutely perfect, why does multiplicity exist? Why does the one become many? His answer shocked his contemporaries. It doesn't decide to. Multiplicity flows from the one, the way light flows from the sun, not through choice, but through necessity of nature. But most religious traditions didn't follow Plotinus. They kept the king model, and the king model creates the problem of evil. If a good, all-powerful sovereign intentionally made the world, why is there suffering? Why injustice? Why do innocent people experience devastating pain? Theologians offered answers: free will, mysterious divine purposes, the necessity of growth through struggle. But the basic tension remained. Perfect intention should produce perfect results. A flawless craftsman with unlimited power shouldn't produce a flawed product. Unless creation isn't what we think it is. Unless the source of being doesn't make things through intention and will. Unless what we call creation is actually something else entirely. Not a project, but a process. Not a choice, but a consequence. And unless the being who does organize reality, who imposes structure, establishes laws, governs form, is not the same as the ultimate source. This distinction was obvious to ancient philosophical traditions. In the 4th century BCE, Plato distinguished between the good, the ultimate principle beyond being, and the Demiurge, the craftsman who shapes the material world. The good doesn't act, it simply is, and all things participate in it. The Demiurge acts. It organizes, structures, imposes form. Two different functions, two different levels of reality, but later theology collapsed them into one figure. God as both infinite source and active creator, both unchanging principle and willful organizer. That collapse created contradictions we've been trying to resolve ever since. It makes the source responsible for imperfection. It turns the infinite into an actor within time. It transforms the principle of being into a being among beings. But ancient thinkers understood something modern theology forgot. Asking, who created the world, is actually asking two completely different questions. First, what is the origin of being itself? What makes existence possible? Second, what organizes existence into structured, governed reality? The first question points to something that cannot act, because action requires time, change, limitation. The second question points to something that must act, because organization requires intention, decision, constraint. Merge those questions, and you get paradox. Separate them, and clarity appears. Not because you've solved the paradoxes with clever arguments, but because you've stopped asking incoherent questions. You stop asking why the source created suffering, because the source doesn't create in that sense. You stop asking why the infinite became finite, because the source doesn't become. It simply is, and finitude emerges through differentiation. You stop trying to reconcile divine perfection with worldly imperfection, because they exist at different levels of manifestation. But this raises the obvious question. If the source doesn't create through command, how does anything come into existence at all? What does creation actually mean when it's not a divine project? Let's establish something foundational, something we explored in depth in the previous video. Ancient thinkers across multiple traditions converged on a radical insight. The ultimate source of reality is not a being. It's the ground that makes being possible. They called it the One, the Good, the Monad, being itself. It has no attributes because attributes are determinations, and the source transcends all determination. It has no location because location requires space, and space emerges within being. It has no beginning because beginnings require time, and time is something that appears within existence. And critically, the source does not act. Action requires change, moving from potentiality to actuality, from not doing to doing. But the source has no potentiality. It's complete in itself, pure actuality. It doesn't decide to exist. It doesn't choose to emanate reality. Being flows from the source the way warmth radiates from fire, not through decision, but through the necessity of its nature. Now, if you're just joining us, that might sound abstract. But what it means is this. The ultimate principle doesn't create like a craftsman creates. It doesn't impose existence through will. Reality emerges from it, necessarily, timelessly, without intention. This is what philosophers meant by emanation, the natural overflow of being itself into differentiated existence. But here's where ancient thinkers made a crucial distinction that later got buried. Emanation is not the same as organization. Let me show you what I mean. Imagine a natural spring in a mountainside. Water flows from it constantly, not because the spring decides to release water, but because that's what springs do. The water flows downward, spreading across the landscape. That's emanation, which we'll cover in more detail in just a bit. So, the source doesn't choose. Flow happens through natural necessity. But now imagine someone building channels, creating irrigation systems, directing that water into structured patterns that sustain crops, fill reservoirs, power mills. That's organization. That requires intention, design, the imposition of structure onto what flows naturally. The spring doesn't organize the water, it just produces it. Someone else, something else, has to turn flowing water into a functional system. Ancient thinkers recognize the same pattern at the cosmic level. The source emanates being, but being doesn't automatically organize itself into a structured cosmos with laws, patterns, hierarchies, and stable forms. For that to happen, something else is required, a principle that operates through limitation. Here's why limitation is necessary. To organize means to distinguish, this from that, here from there, now from then. It means establishing boundaries, creating categories, imposing limits. But the source, being infinite and undifferentiated, has no boundaries. Everything that can be already exists within it as pure potential. There's no this versus that at the source level. No distinctions, no separation, which means organization, the creation of structured, differentiated reality, cannot happen at the level of the source. It requires a principle that has boundaries, that operates through distinction, that works by limiting infinite potential into finite forms. Plotinus described this with striking clarity in the 3rd century. The One, he said, is absolutely simple. It has no parts, no divisions, no internal complexity. From it, reality proceeds in stages. First nous, divine intellect, then soul, then the material world. Each stage is more complex, more differentiated, more limited than the one before. Not because something was lost, but because differentiation increases with distance from absolute unity, and at each stage, new capacities appear, capacities the source itself doesn't have. This is the critical insight. There's a difference between the origin of being and the organization of reality. Origin requires an infinite, unchanging, non-acting principle, what we've been calling the source. Organization requires intention, will, the capacity to distinguish and limit, what ancient thinkers recognized as a different function entirely. Philo of Alexandria, writing in the 1st century, grappled with exactly this tension. He was trying to reconcile Jewish scripture, which portrayed God as active, creating, commanding, with Greek philosophy, which understood the ultimate as utterly transcendent. His solution? The Logos. God himself, Philo argued, is beyond all action and attribute. But the Logos, the divine word, the organizing principle, serves as the intermediary through which formless being receives form. The Logos doesn't create being from nothing. It structures being that already flows from the source. It's the architect, not the foundation, the designer, not the material, the principle that turns infinite potential into finite actuality. Now here's what traditional theology did. It collapsed both functions into a single figure, God as infinite source and God as active creator, being itself and divine craftsman, unchanging principle and willful organizer. But those are contradictory roles. It's like trying to make the spring both the source of water and the irrigation engineer simultaneously. Once you separate the functions, the contradictions dissolve. Now, let's expand a little bit more on the concept of emanation. Imagine standing in a vast cathedral as a bell is struck. You don't hear one sound, you hear layers. The fundamental tone rings out clearly, but beneath and around it, harmonic overtones emerge, higher frequencies that weren't there before the bell was struck, yet flow naturally from the vibration of the metal. The bell doesn't decide to produce overtones. They arise necessarily from the physics of vibration. One pure tone differentiates into complex harmony without intention, without choice. This is the closest physical analogy to what ancient philosophers meant by emanation. Reality doesn't spring into existence through divine command. It unfolds in stages from the source, each stage more differentiated than the last, each arising necessarily from what came before. Plotinus spent decades contemplating this process in the 3rd century, developing what would become one of the most sophisticated metaphysical systems in Western thought. The One, he taught, is absolutely simple, pure unity with no internal divisions. But perfection overflows, not because it lacks anything, not because it decides to share, but because overflow is the natural consequence of absolute fullness. Think of a spring so full that water spills over its edges. The spring doesn't choose to overflow. Overflow happens because fullness has nowhere else to go. From that overflow, the first differentiation appears. Nous, divine intellect. Nous is still unified, still divine, but now there's a distinction that didn't exist in the One. The the distinction between knower and known, between thinking and thought. From nous, soul emerges, the principle that bridges the eternal and the temporal, the unchanging and the changing. And from soul, the material world takes shape, the most differentiated, most complex, most distant manifestation of the original unity. Each stage is less unified than the one before, not because something is lost, but because differentiation increases with distance from the source. Imagine a tree. The roots are hidden, undifferentiated, pure potential for growth, invisible beneath the soil. The trunk emerges, singular and strong, channeling that potential upward. Then branches divide and multiply, spreading in all directions. Finally, leaves appear in infinite variety, each unique, each different, yet all sustained by the same invisible root system. The roots don't decide to create leaves. The leaves emerge through natural stages of differentiation from a single source. In the same way, Plotinus argued, multiplicity emerges from the one without decision, without intention. It's not creation in the modern sense. It's manifestation through necessary stages. And here's the crucial insight. Intention only appears after differentiation. The one has no intention because there's no separation between knower and known, doer and done. It simply is, completely and timelessly. But as being differentiates, separation appears. Subject and object, knower and known, agent and action. And with separation comes the possibility, the necessity, of intention. Because intention is the bridge across separation. When you're completely unified with something, you don't intend toward it, you are it. But when there's distance, intention emerges as the way separated things relate. This is why the Gnostic aeons, the divine emanations, were sometimes described in pairs, in harmonious relationship with each other. Not because they were married couples in some cosmic drama, but because pairing represented the balance that maintains stability at each level of differentiation. When differentiation remains balanced, when the proportions stay harmonious, emanation unfolds naturally without disruption. But differentiation creates inherent instability. Here's why. Unity is stable by nature. The one, being absolutely simple, cannot conflict with itself, cannot divide, cannot change. But multiplicity is unstable by nature. Return to the musical analogy. A single pure tone is stable. It simply is what it is, unchanging. But multiple tones create either harmony or dissonance depending on their relationship. 3 notes can form a beautiful chord or a jarring clash. Same notes, different arrangement, completely different experience. In the same way, differentiated being can arrange itself harmoniously or chaotically. And without something to organize it, multiplicity tends toward instability. Not moral chaos, structural instability. Unorganized complexity that lacks coherent form. The Gnostic texts describe this moment symbolically. Sophia, wisdom, the outermost aeon at the boundary of the pleroma, attempts to know the unknowable source directly, without mediation, without the balanced proportion that maintains stability. Don't read this as a character making a choice. Read it as the limit of what differentiation can do. It's the structural strain that appears when the outer boundary of emanation tries to reflect absolute unity beyond its capacity. Like a mirror attempting to reflect infinity, the mirror can only show finite reflections. Push it beyond that capacity, and the reflection fractures. That fracturing, that imbalance, creates something outside the harmonious flow of emanation, not through punishment, not through moral failure, through structural necessity. When differentiation exceeds its natural limit, when the attempt to reflect unity breaks proportion, instability appears, and from that instability, a new principle emerges, one that doesn't participate in the harmonious flow from the source, one that operates in separation, in limitation, in the realm where unity has fragmented into unorganized multiplicity. This is where organization becomes necessary, because if being is going to manifest as a stable, structured world rather than chaotic flux, something has to impose order, patterns, laws, relationships that remain consistent. boundaries that keep distinct things distinct, hierarchies that prevent collapse back into undifferentiated potential. Not moral order, structural order, the conditions that make coherent existence possible. But organization requires an organizer, a principle that doesn't just emanate being, but structures it. A function that operates through limitation, because all organization is limitation. To make something specifically this rather than that, you have to limit possibilities. You have to establish boundaries. You have to say, this far and no further. This is where creation, in the sense we usually mean it, finally begins. Not as the origin of being, that's emanation, but as the organization of being into structured, governed form. And the principle that performs this function is about to become very important. Imagine you're in ancient Alexandria, walking through the great library around 200 CE. In one corner, you find philosophers debating a fascinating problem. What exists before form? Not nothing, they agree. Being has already emanated from the source, so there's existence, presence, reality of some kind, but it's not yet ordered reality. One philosopher stands and gestures as he speaks. Think of clay, he says. It exists. It has substance, mass, reality. But it's not yet anything specific. It could become a bowl, a figure, a tile. The potential is there, but the form isn't. Another philosopher nods. Until someone imposes form, the clay remains formless potential. This is the question that consumed ancient thinkers. How does potential become actual? How does formless being become structured reality? The answer they reached was startling in its simplicity: limitation. Form is limitation. To be a specific thing means not being other things. A bowl is a bowl because it's limited to bowl shape, bowl function, bowl nature. If it had no limits, it wouldn't be a bowl. It would be everything and therefore nothing in particular. In the same way, for a cosmos to exist, for there to be distinct objects, stable patterns, consistent relationships, formless being has to receive limits. Potential has to be constrained into actuality, and limitation requires rules. Not arbitrary rules, necessary ones. Rules that say, matter behaves this way, energy moves like this, cause produces effect in this pattern. Without these rules, nothing would remain stable. Think about what the absence of structure would mean. Without gravity, planets don't orbit. They scatter randomly through space. Without atomic structure, matter doesn't form. It remains quantum probability, never solidifying into anything you could touch or see. Without biological laws, organisms don't grow in predictable patterns. Cells would divide chaotically, never forming functional bodies. Structure isn't the enemy of existence. It's the requirement for existence to become manifest and stable. But structure also creates hierarchy, not moral, ontological. Some principles become foundational, others become derivative. Think of a building, Aristotle would argue in the 4th century BCE. The foundation comes first. It bears the weight, determines what can be built above it. The walls come next, depending on the foundation, but creating space for everything else. The roof comes last, depending on both foundation and walls. You can't reverse that order. The hierarchy isn't arbitrary, it's structural necessity. Similarly, once reality becomes organized, certain principles have to be foundational. Laws of motion, patterns of cause and effect, the structure of time and space. They're the governing conditions that make everything else possible, and governing conditions require a governor. A function that says, this is the pattern, this is the law. This is how being will manifest at this level of reality. According to ancient philosophical traditions, that is what creation actually is. Not the origin of being, that's emanation from the source, but the imposition of form onto being. Plato saw this clearly in the 4th century BCE. In his Timaeus, he distinguished between the eternal forms, perfect, unchanging patterns, and the material world, which is a kind of imperfect reflection of those patterns. But he also recognized that someone or something had to bridge the gap between eternal perfection and temporal manifestation. The Demiurge looks at the eternal forms and shapes material reality to resemble them as closely as matter allows. It's not creating being from nothing. It's imposing intelligible structure onto what already exists in potential. And this is why authority emerges at this stage. Authority isn't inherent to the source. The source has no need for authority. But authority appears when there's separation, when there are distinct things that need coordination, organization, regulation. A governor emerges because governing becomes necessary, the principle that holds the structure together and maintains the laws. This governing principle isn't evil in the way we perceive evil. It's a necessary consequence of manifestation. If being is going to appear as a structured world rather than remaining undifferentiated potential, there has to be limitation. Form requires a former. Order requires an orderer. But, and this is critical, the orderer is not the source. The source doesn't impose limits because the source is unlimited. So the governing principle has to be something that emerges within the process of emanation and differentiation. Something that has the characteristics the source lacks: will, intention, capacity for action within time. Something that can work with boundaries, operate through limitation, establish and enforce structure. In ancient philosophical and mystical traditions, this principle had various names. Plato called this figure the Demiurge, the craftsman. Gnostic texts referred to it also as the archon, the ruler. Some called it the world soul or the logos in its organizing capacity. Different terminology, same function. Not ultimate reality, but the governing principle of manifest reality. And understanding this distinction between source and organizer, between infinite principle and governing function, is what unlocks everything that comes next. Now, in modern culture, the Demiurge is often viewed as an ignorant god who trapped souls in matter, who rules through deception, who must be escaped or overthrown. But for Plato, that's not what the Demiurge was. So let's establish how ancient thinkers actually understood it. The Demiurge is the principle that organizes undifferentiated being into structured, governed form. It operates through limitation, because form is limitation. It works through intention, because organization requires direction. It establishes hierarchy, because structure requires ordered relationships. And it rules the material cosmos, not as a usurper, but as the function necessary to maintain coherent manifestation. So, here's the key. The Demiurge doesn't create being. It shapes being that already exists. Think back to Plato's Timaeus, written in the 4th century BCE. The Demiurge is explicitly described as a craftsman, not a creator in the absolute sense. A craftsman doesn't create the materials. A sculptor doesn't create marble. An architect doesn't create stone and wood. They take what already exists and impose form on it. They limit infinite possibilities into specific actualities. They organize raw material into structured reality. That's what the Demiurge does at the cosmic level. Being has already emanated from the source. Potential already exists, formless, undifferentiated, chaotic. The Demiurge's role is to organize that potential into the structured, law-governed cosmos we inhabit. So, why is the Demiurge described in some texts as incomplete rather than perfect? Because completion, in the metaphysical sense, means unity with the source. The source is complete. It lacks nothing, contains everything as pure potential, remains utterly unified. But the Demiurge, by definition, operates at a level of differentiation and separation. It exists at a distance from the source, not a spatial distance, but an ontological one. Degrees of emanation separate it from the infinite ground of being. And because it's separated, it doesn't have direct awareness of what lies beyond its realm. As mentioned before, Plotinus described this precisely in the 3rd century. The one is beyond all knowing because knowing requires duality, a knower and a known. But the one is absolutely simple, with no internal division. Nous The first emanation can think because it has the minimal duality necessary for thought. But as emanation proceeds through stages, each level becomes more limited in its awareness of what came before. Soul knows nous, but has dimmer awareness of the One, and the organizing principle of the material world. Its consciousness is limited to the realm it governs. Think of it like this. If you're deep inside a complex building, you can know that building intimately. You can map every room, every hallway, every structural detail, but you don't have the perspective of someone standing outside, seeing the building as a whole in relation to the landscape around it. Your knowledge is complete within your scope, but your scope is limited by your position. Likewise, the Demiurge's awareness is complete within the realm it governs, the material cosmos, the laws of form, the structures of manifestation. But it doesn't have awareness of the infinite source from which all being ultimately flows. This isn't moral ignorance, it's structural limitation. The Demiurge is the principle that works with boundaries. It can't simultaneously be the principle beyond all boundaries. Now here's where this gets important. Because the Demiurge lacks awareness of the source, it mistakes itself for ultimate reality, not through arrogance or deception, through structural necessity. If you can only see the building from inside, you naturally assume that's all there is. There's nothing in your experience that points beyond it. By the same logic, if your consciousness is bounded by the realm of form and structure, you naturally assume form and structure are ultimate. There's nothing in your awareness that points to the infinite, formless source. The Gnostic text, the Apocryphon of John, written in the 2nd century, depicts this starkly. The chief archon, the Demiurge, declares, "I am God, and there is no other God beside me." Modern readers see this as blasphemy or lies, but ancient Gnostics understood it as the inevitable conclusion of limited awareness. From within the system appears absolute. It's only from outside, from a perspective that remembers the source, that the limitation becomes visible. And this is why the Demiurge governs through authority rather than awareness. At the source level, there's no need for authority because there's no separation. You don't need external laws to govern yourself when you're unified with your own being. But once differentiation creates separation, authority becomes necessary to maintain coherent structure. The Demiurge establishes laws, enforces boundaries, maintains hierarchy, not out of tyranny, but because that's what governance at this level requires. Without external authority, the structure collapses. Laws of physics aren't oppression. They're the conditions that make physical reality possible. Biological constraints aren't imprisonment. They're what allows biological life to exist in stable forms. Temporal sequence isn't a trap. It's what permits change, growth, experience. The Demiurge establishes and maintains these conditions as the organizing function that makes manifestation possible. So why does this figure appear in some texts as antagonistic to the source or to spiritual awakening? Because of the difference between function and ultimate truth. The Demiurge governs the realm of form. It maintains boundaries, limitations, structures that define material existence. But spiritual awakening, gnosis, recognition of the source, involves transcending those limitations, not by destroying them, but by recognizing they're not ultimate. That's what awakening really means, recognizing your divine nature while inhabiting a material form. Form is real, but it's not all of reality. Structure is necessary, but it's not the deepest truth. The material cosmos exists, but it's not identical with the source of being. From the perspective of someone awakening to the source, the Demiurge's realm can feel constraining. Not necessarily because it's evil, but because it's limited. This is where symbolic language can become easy to misread. The Demiurge is the principle of limitation itself, and limitation, from the perspective of infinite consciousness, feels restrictive. But without limitation, there's no manifestation. Without structure, there's no cosmos. Without the Demiurge's organizing function, being remains undifferentiated potential, rather than becoming an actual, inhabitable world. So the system governed by the Demiurge is necessary, just not ultimate. It's the principle that makes the material world possible, but not the source from which all being flows. Understanding that distinction prevents the most common misreading, treating ancient cosmology as a battle between good and evil gods. It's not a battle, it's a structure. Nested levels of reality, each with its own principle, each necessary for manifestation to proceed from infinite source to finite form. This is how ancient thinkers understood creation, through the lens of demiurgic governance. And before you dismiss philosophical thinking as poetic nonsense, let me let you in on a little secret. Do you know what the elites actually teach their children? Let me just say it's not what your kids are taught at school. Among other things that you probably wouldn't think about, like agriculture. Yes, agriculture. They also teach them philosophy. I wonder why that is. That should give you something to think about for a while. Now, coming back to our line of thought, if creation was understood as demiurgic governance, how should we read the ancient texts that describe all of this in symbolic, mythic language? Let's return to the Gnostic texts, because they offer one of the clearest demonstrations of the principles we've been tracing. Where philosophy uses abstract language, source, emanation, differentiation, limitation, Gnostic cosmology uses story. And that story maps perfectly onto the metaphysical structure we've been building. Let me show you the basic framework of their cosmology, and then we'll learn how to read it correctly. At the origin is the pleroma, fullness, the totality of divine being. This is what we've been calling the source, the one, the infinite ground of existence. From the pleroma emanate the aeons, divine principles or attributes, often described in pairs. These aren't separate gods. They're stages of differentiation from the source, each representing a degree of manifestation. Think of them as the harmonic overtones we discussed earlier, not separate from the fundamental tone, but distinct expressions of it at different frequencies. Among these aeons is Sophia, wisdom. This aeon represents the outermost boundary of the pleroma, the last stable point of emanation before being becomes unstable. According to the texts, Sophia desires to know the unknowable source directly, without mediation, without her paired consort, without the balanced proportion that maintains stability. This creates imbalance, and from that imbalance, something emerges outside the harmonious pleroma, the Demiurge and his realm, the material cosmos. The Demiurge, unaware of the source beyond his realm, mistakes himself for ultimate reality and proceeds to organize the material cosmos, imposing structure, establishing laws, governing through authority. Later, Christ descends to restore awareness of the source to those who have forgotten it, not through conquest, but through revelation. Not by destroying the Demiurge's realm, but by reintroducing recognition of what lies beyond it. That's the basic structure. We've explored the full cosmology in detail in other videos you can watch later, but here, what matters is the underlying structure, because that narrative demonstrates perfectly the principles we've been discussing. The pleroma is the source, infinite, undifferentiated, beyond all form. The aeons are stages of emanation, differentiation proceeding from unity in balanced proportions. Sophia's overextension is the moment when differentiation becomes unstable, when the outer boundary attempts to reflect absolute unity beyond its structural capacity. The Demiurge is the organizing principle that emerges from that instability, imposing structure on what would otherwise remain chaotic. And Christ is the reintegration of awareness, the restoration of connection to the source within a system that had forgotten its origin. Perfect parallel to the metaphysical framework. But here's the problem. If you read that narrative literally, as a story about divine beings making choices, having desires, creating worlds like characters in a drama, you completely miss what it's actually describing. So let's learn how to read it correctly. First, we must recognize that ancient writers faced a fundamental limitation. They were trying to describe non-human, metaphysical processes, emanation, differentiation, the emergence of structure from formlessness, but they only had human language to work with. Language built for describing people, actions, decisions, relationships. So they did what wisdom traditions across cultures have always done. They compressed abstract metaphysics into narrative form. They gave processes names. They turned principles into characters. They described ontological dynamics as if they were biographical events. This wasn't deception, it was translation. The same way modern physicists say particles want to reach ground state, or fields prefer lower energy configurations. Without meaning, particles literally have desires or preferences. The language is anthropomorphic because human minds grasp reality through story, through action, through relationship. But the reality being described isn't anthropomorphic at all. When the texts say Sophia desired to know the monad, they're not describing an emotional state. Sophia isn't sitting in the pleroma feeling curious, weighing options, deciding to act. Sophia is the principle of wisdom operating at the boundary of stable emanation, the outermost point before differentiation exceeds its natural limit. And desiring to know the monad is symbolic language for what happens when differentiated consciousness attempts to directly apprehend undifferentiated unity beyond its structural capacity. It's not psychology, it's metaphysics. It's describing the strain that appears when the outer limit of what can be known tries to grasp what lies beyond the capacity of knowing itself. The texts say Sophia acted without the consent of her consort, or without agreement with the other aeons. Read literally, this sounds like rule-breaking, rebellion, moral transgression. But that completely misses what the language is pointing toward. In Platonic philosophy, which deeply influenced Gnostic thought, consent and agreement refer to harmonic proportion. When elements exist in proper proportion to each other, they're in agreement. When that proportion is violated, discord appears. Think musically again. 3 notes in the right proportional relationship create a consonant chord. Change one note by a half step, and the harmony breaks. Not because the notes disagreed, but because the mathematical relationship between their frequencies was disrupted. The dissonance isn't moral failure, it's structural imbalance. In the same way, without consent means outside harmonious proportionality. Sophia's action represents the moment when the outer boundary of emanation attempts something beyond its proportional capacity, like a structure bearing more weight than its design allows. Not rebellion, structural overextension. So Sophia is not a person or a being who made a mistake. She's the outer limit of the pleroma. She represents wisdom operating at the edge of what can be known, the last point where differentiated consciousness can maintain harmonious relationship with the source. But here's the problem that ancient thinkers recognized. Differentiation cannot comprehend the undifferentiated directly. A wave, precisely because it is a wave, bounded, formed, defined, cannot understand the ocean by ceasing to be a wave. It can only know the ocean through its limited perspective as wave. In the same way, Sophia, operating at a differentiated level, however subtle, cannot directly grasp the absolutely undifferentiated source. The attempt creates ontological strain, like metal stressed beyond its tolerance, like a bridge extended past its load-bearing capacity. And from that strain, something emerges. Instability at the boundary, imbalance in the proportion, a disturbance in the harmonious flow of emanation. That instability is what gives rise to the Demiurge and the material realm, not as punishment, as consequence. The texts describe the Demiurge as ignorant, unaware of the pleroma, claiming to be the only god. Modern readers read arrogance, deception, even evil, but the Gnostics weren't describing moral failings. They were describing structural limitation. The Demiurge's ignorance is the necessary condition of a principle that operates entirely within the realm of form. Think of it this way. A computer program, however sophisticated, operates within its code. It can perform incredibly complex operations within its parameters, but it has no awareness of the programmer, the hardware it runs on, or the world outside the system. That's not a moral deficiency. It's the nature of what it is. The Demiurge operates entirely within the realm it governs, the material cosmos, organized according to laws and structures it establishes and maintains. Within that realm, it has complete mastery. but it has no awareness of the infinite source from which being ultimately flows. Like we said before, when texts like the Apocryphon of John depict the Demiurge declaring, "I am God and there is no other," they're not describing a lie. They're describing the inevitable conclusion of consciousness that only knows form, mistaking form for ultimate reality. From inside the system appears absolute, but its scope is limited, and it lacks awareness of what lies beyond that scope. The texts also describe Christ descending into the Demiurge's realm to restore gnosis, knowledge of the source. Read literally, this sounds like a rescue mission. But Christ, in Gnostic cosmology, is the Logos, the Word, the principle of divine reason and coherent structure that emanates directly from the source. The Logos is what makes the infinite source intelligible. It's the principle through which formless being becomes structured reality while maintaining connection to its origin. In the cosmology, the Logos represents that primary emanation that carries the pattern of the source into manifestation, making the unknowable knowable, the formless intelligible. Christ doesn't decide to descend the way a person decides to help someone in trouble. Christ as Logos represents the reintegration of awareness into a system that had lost connection to its origin. Think of it as coherence being restored where structure had hardened into pure law. The Demiurge governs through external authority, rules without understanding, law divorced from awareness of what the law serves. Christ represents the return of awareness to structure, the recognition that form exists to manifest the source, not to replace it. This isn't a battle between rival deities. It's the restoration of balance between structure and source, between governance and gnosis, between external authority and internal recognition. The Logos makes the system intelligible again, showing how structure points back to source rather than claiming to be ultimate. It's restoration, not conquest. So, here's the principle that unlocks everything. These figures are functions, not characters. Processes, not people. Maps of reality and consciousness, not divine biography. When you read about Sophia's desire, think. The structural strain when differentiation attempts to reflect unity beyond its capacity. When you read about the Demiurge's ignorance, think. Consciousness bounded by form, unaware of the formless source beyond. When you read about Christ's descent, think. The reintegration of source awareness into organized structure. The narrative is a teaching device, a way to make abstract metaphysics memorable and transmissible. It compresses complex processes into symbolic form. But the reality it describes isn't narrative, it's structure. The same exact structure we've been tracing. Source to emanation, to differentiation, to instability, to organization, to governance, to restoration of awareness. Gnostic cosmology maps that structure using mythic language. Philosophy maps it using abstract concepts. But they're describing the same reality, the same nested levels through which infinite being manifests as finite form. Once you understand that, you stop asking the wrong questions. You stop wondering, why would Sophia make that choice? Because there was no choice, only structural necessity. You stop asking, is the Demiurge evil? Because it's not a moral agent, it's a governing function. You stop thinking of Christ as a superhero, because the process is restoration of recognition, not external salvation. You start looking at texts, and not just Gnostic texts, for what they are. Sophisticated metaphysical maps, expressed in the only language available to ancient writers, the language of story, symbol, and myth. Now, if the Demiurge is simply the organizing function, necessary but limited, then why does authority at this level sometimes feel oppressive? Why does governance become problematic? Let's think carefully about what authority actually is. At its most basic, authority is the power to establish and enforce rules from outside, not through recognition or natural alignment, through external imposition that demands compliance. And authority only becomes necessary when there's separation. Picture two scenarios. In the first, you're completely unified with your own body. You don't need external commands to make your heart beat, to regulate your breathing, to coordinate your movements. These happen naturally, through internal coherence. In the second, you're operating a complex machine. Now you need external instructions, manuals, guidelines, procedures that tell you what to do because you're separate from the machine. There's no natural unity between you and it. Authority emerges in that second scenario. When knower and known are separated, when subject and object are distinct, external rules become necessary to bridge the gap. This is why authority cannot exist at the source level. The source has no separation. Authority would be meaningless because there's nothing separate to compel, nothing external to govern. But at the level of the Demiurge, the level of organized, structured reality, separation is fundamental. Form requires boundaries. Boundaries create distinction. Distinction creates separation. Subject and object. Ruler and ruled. Governor and governed. And once you have that separation, authority becomes structurally necessary to maintain coherent organization. Without external rules, the system fragments. Without enforcement, boundaries dissolve. Without authority, organized reality collapses back into undifferentiated potential. So authority, in this form, is structural necessity at this level of manifestation. Think about the laws of nature, what we call physical constants, mathematical relationships, causal patterns. These are authoritative. Gravity compels. The speed of light is absolute. Cause necessarily produces effect according to consistent patterns. You can't negotiate with gravity or persuade entropy to reverse. You can't reason with thermodynamic laws. These laws simply are, and material existence must conform to them. That's authority in its pure form, the imposition of structure that must be obeyed for the system to function. The Demiurge establishes these conditions, not arbitrarily, but as the necessary framework for stable material existence. And within its proper scope, this works perfectly. Physical laws governing physical reality, functional and necessary. Biological constraints shaping biological life, essential for coherent organisms. Temporal sequence creating before and after, required for change and experience. No problems. The Demiurge does exactly what organizing principles must do, but here's where things become complicated. Authority works when its scope remains appropriate to its level. The problem emerges when authority mistakes its level for ultimate reality, when governance claims to be absolute rather than functional. Because authority says, obey from outside, but the source says, recognize from within. Authority operates through enforcement. The source operates through awareness. And when a governing system forgets its derivative, when it claims to be ultimate, it replaces recognition with obedience. Not necessarily through malice, but through the structural blindness we discussed earlier. If your consciousness is bounded by the system you govern, you naturally assume the system is everything. And if the system is everything, then obedience to the system becomes absolute. Think about how this pattern appears in human institutions. An institution is created to serve a purpose, to maintain order, preserve knowledge, enforce useful standards, perfectly functional within its scope. But institutions have a tendency to forget they're servants of something beyond themselves. They begin to identify the rules with the truth, the structure with the reality, the institution with the ultimate. Political systems forget they're meant to serve the people and start demanding the people serve the system. Educational institutions forget they're meant to cultivate understanding and start demanding conformity to credentials and procedures. Legal systems forget they're meant to serve justice and start serving their own perpetuation. In every case, the pattern is identical. A functional structure mistakes itself for ultimate reality and replaces service with sovereignty. The Demiurge operates according to this same pattern, because it's the nature of governing systems that lack awareness of what lies beyond them. And this creates a specific tension for those who awaken to the source. Systems that claim ultimate authority demand you suppress your own recognition in favor of external obedience. They say, don't trust your direct experience. Trust the authority. Don't rely on your own understanding. Rely on the institution. Don't recognize truth for yourself. Obey what you're told is true. And this works perfectly for maintaining the system. Obedience creates stability. Conformity creates predictable order. External authority creates manageable structure. but it cuts you off from recognizing the source, because the source is known through direct awareness, not external command, through recognition of what you already are, not imposition of what you should be. This is the tension between governance and gnosis that ancient texts describe. Governance says, obey the law. Gnosis says, understand what the law points toward and recognize what lies beyond it. Governance says, submit to external authority. Gnosis says, recognize the source that authority has forgotten. Neither is wrong within its scope. But when governance forgets it's functional and claims to be ultimate, when the organizing principle mistakes itself for the source, it becomes an obstacle to recognition rather than a support for manifestation. And that's the inherent limitation of systems operating without awareness of what transcends them. This pattern is structural, which means it appears wherever organized systems exist, including religious ones. And that brings us to what might be the most important realization of all. So let's return to the question we started with. Did God actually create the world? The answer depends entirely on what you mean by God and what you mean by create. If by God you mean the infinite source of being, the one, the ultimate principle from which all existence flows, then know that God didn't create the world. Because creation, in the way most people imagine it, implies action, decision, will, intention, and the source doesn't act. It simply is. Being emanates from the source not through command, but through ontological necessity, the natural overflow of absolute fullness, in the way heat radiates from fire. That's not creation in the traditional sense. That's manifestation. But if by God you mean the organizing principle that imposes structure on differentiated being, the function that establishes laws, maintains boundaries, governs the material cosmos, then yes, that God created the world. Not by originating being itself, but by organizing being that already exists into stable, structured form. Creation in this sense isn't the beginning of existence, it's the imposition of order on what already is. And ancient thinkers recognized this distinction clearly, that these are two different functions, operating at two different levels. The source, infinite, unchanging, beyond all action and attribute. The demiurge, finite, active, organizing through limitation and law. One does not act, the other must. One is ultimate, the other is necessary, but derivative. This framework solves problems that theology created by collapsing these levels together. It explains why perfection doesn't produce perfection, because what appears imperfect at the material level is actually complexity and diversity at the metaphysical level. Different stages of emanation, each necessary, each real. It explains why order requires limitation, because unlimited potential doesn't automatically organize itself. Structure emerges through boundaries, and boundaries require a principle that operates through limitation. It explains why authority emerges, because separated beings need external governance when they've lost awareness of the internal unity that would make external rules unnecessary. And it explains why the God of religious institutions often feels more like a ruler than a source, because theology merged two incompatible functions into one figure. And that merger happened in Christianity through institutional necessity. Early Christianity inherited this layered framework. The concept of the logos, the understanding of God beyond being, the recognition of mediating principles between infinite and finite. But as Christianity developed into an institution, as it needed to scale, to create hierarchies of authority, to establish orthodox doctrine that everyone could understand and accept, the layers had to collapse and the distinction had to be removed. The infinite source had to become a personal creator who makes decisions, issues commands, chooses representatives. The organizing function had to merge with ultimate reality so that obedience to institutional law could be presented as obedience to God Himself. The distinction between governance and gnosis had to disappear so that external authority could claim to be the path to divine truth. This made Christianity accessible, unified, and powerful as an institution. You could teach it to anyone. You could build a universal church around it. You could create clear hierarchies and enforce orthodoxy. But it buried the original framework. It created theological paradoxes that have occupied brilliant minds for centuries, because the paradoxes are artifacts of the collapse itself. If God is both infinite source and active creator, how can he be unchanging, yet act in time? If he's both perfect and personal, why does he create an imperfect world? If he's both beyond being and a being who commands, which is he ultimately? These questions only arise when you've merged what was meant to stay distinct. Restore the distinction, and the contradictions dissolve. Only because you've returned to the framework that existed before the theological collapse, the framework where source and governance operate at different levels, connected but not identical. And here's what becomes possible when you understand that framework. You can honor structure without mistaking it for ultimate reality. You can participate in organized systems, religious, social, political, without surrendering your recognition of the source. You can obey necessary laws at the material level, without treating those laws as absolute truth, because the Demiurge's governance is real. But it's not ultimate. The deepest truth remains what it's always been, the infinite source from which all being flows, accessible not through obedience to external commands, but through recognition of what you already are, known not through institutional mediation, but through awareness itself. And that source doesn't demand worship. It invites awakening, not to escape the world, but to recognize what the world is. Organized structure, but not the ground of reality. A level of existence, not existence itself. A governed cosmos, not the infinite source. Now, if this framework, the distinction between source and organizer, is fundamental to how reality is structured, then where else does this pattern appear? Because if the Demiurge is a function, not a unique figure, who rules through law while remaining unaware of what lies beyond, that pattern should be recognizable across multiple traditions, under other names, which raises an uncomfortable question for anyone raised in a biblical tradition. What if the God described in the Hebrew Bible, powerful, law-giving, demanding exclusive worship, fits the pattern of the Demiurge rather than the source? That's where we're going next. If you're enjoying this series, leave a like, subscribe, and stay tuned. Until next time, keep questioning.